Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad to welcome back to the program Nikki Morse, who's a Baltimore-based educator and activist with the International Solidarity Movement. They are also active with Jewish Voice for Peace. Nikki, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Absolutely excited to have you. And today we have invited you on the show to talk about your very recent trip to the West Bank and occupied Palestine with, as I noted in your bio, the International Solidarity Movement. So before we get rolling with your specific experiences in the West Bank, could you just tell listeners what the International Solidarity Movement is?
Absolutely. ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, was founded in 2001 during the Second Intifada. It's a movement that is not so much an organization as a structure for individuals who are in solidarity with Palestine to support each other in doing solidarity work, following the lead of Palestinians. ISM has four key principles. We're Palestinian-led. We use nonviolence as our preferred strategy and tactic. We are consensus-based, so decisions are made by consensus among the people who would be impacted by the decision, and we're anti-oppressive, so we resist all forms of oppression, in addition to specifically fighting the occupation of Palestine. And over the years, ISM has gone through a number of different iterations and formations. Many people know ISM because of Rachel Corrie, who was a volunteer with ISM and was killed by Israel in Gaza early on in the movement's history. And then more recently, Aishner Agi was also killed by Israel. And there have been a couple of other ISM volunteers who have died. And so in many cases, that's what people know about ISM. And one thing I always try to emphasize when I'm training people or when I'm onboarding people for our work is, the goal is never to create martyrs. The goal is to support the liberation of Palestine. The violence is coming from the occupation, and it's unavoidable. We have to be prepared for that. But like myself, just got back after a month on the ground. Hundreds and hundreds of people over the years have volunteered with ISM and have been able to do this work and come back to tell the stories. And for our Palestinian coordinators, that's the piece that they emphasize as the most important. The work on the ground matters, but they say it's 40% on the ground, 60% when you return. To tell the stories, to uplift the witness work that we did, and also to make sure that our home communities and the governments in our home countries are aware that people are watching, people are paying attention. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to do that piece of the work that our Palestinian leaders feel is most important.
Well, we are glad to do it. I mean, the whole objective of Project Censored is to cover what doesn't get covered in other places. And I don't think that ISM gets a lot of coverage in places like, the New York Times or CBS or Fox News. So, but I wanted to ask, you said the 60-40. What are the goals on the ground then? What is the purpose of folks like yourself being on the ground in occupied Palestine?
It's a great question. And to be honest, it's one of the things that many of us are really processing because the pace of ethnic cleansing is accelerating so quickly on the ground. And as Israel becomes more and more of a pariah state, the impact of international observers, it feels like it is less powerful. There was a time, and obviously this is never completely true because Rachel Corrie was murdered in the early 2000s, but there was a time when there was a much stronger impression that Israel was concerned about the negative press that would come from its crimes being seen by international observers or its crimes impacting international observers. At this point, there's a fear that that is not going to be as applicable going forward because it's so clear that the Zionist state does not care about world opinion. At the same time, on the ground, Palestinians report to us that when we are present, doing protective presence or accompaniment work, which is the majority of ISM's work right now, they feel a little safer, and they observe anecdotally that it seems that settlers are a little less escalated, that the army is a little less violent. And again, none of this is 100%. And I can get into some of the stories of specifically, what I witnessed on the ground. But the goal is to be present, to hopefully de-escalate things, provide a little bit of a cushion, and also just to provide witness and assurance to people in Palestine that they are not forgotten, that their lives matter. It is meaningful for families to know that the international community includes people who care. For children to be able to meet folks from outside of Palestine and learn that people around the world care and want them to be safe and want them to be able to have the rights that they're currently denied. So a lot of that is what the work is. And on a day-to-day basis, it's a lot of showing up to a family's home and drinking tea, talking with them, hearing their story, and being present so that if/when settlers show up or the army arrives, the actions that then are taken happen with that witness present, that international witness present. And then also going out in the fields with shepherds, which is one of the things that I personally love the most. Like, the land is so beautiful, and getting to work with the shepherds and, accompany them and their sheep is a really meaningful experience. And because one of the main tools of ethnic cleansing that the settlement movement is using right now in the areas that ISM works is their own settler shepherds colonizing land, taking over land, driving out Palestinian shepherds. Going with the shepherds is a really vital way to enable families to stay, because if they can't take their sheep out, then it's about 4 times as expensive to feed each sheep. It goes from about 250 shekels to 1,000 shekels a year for each individual sheep. And these flocks are flocks of 50 to 100 to 400. So the grazing is vital. Being able to support them and being able to take their flocks out to graze is something that day by day, enables these families to resist. And that really is the kind of resistance that ISM is able to support, is that daily insistence on staying, the daily refusal to leave, even with all the pressure that people are facing.
Yeah, and I do want to get into some of these stories and your experiences, of course, but really quick, I wanted to ask, because of course you work with Jewish Voice for Peace, and I feel like some people might be wondering, well, does your presence there mean more as an international observer, or the fact that you are Jewish? And I don't know if you would wear any kind of things that would identify that, like a yarmulke or a tzitzit or something like that. But could you talk about which one of those would be most important in that setting, if even the fact that you are Jewish matters?
It's such a interesting and important question. And I do want to be clear that I'm speaking as a white Jewish American who gets read as a woman, although I'm genderqueer. And I am a US citizen. So, these are all factors that go into it. On a very baseline, what ISM has found is that passport privilege is a very real thing. And even volunteers who are people of color, even volunteers who are Muslim, Arab, or even Palestinian, if they have that international passport, they are able to do work that Palestinians cannot, and they are able to provide that protective presence. But that said, the more visible that you are as an international, white privilege is very real. And then finally, being Jewish has many different layers in doing this work. In terms of access to the country, being Jewish is really helpful. I don't have a legibly Jewish last name, and I didn't wear anything that marked me as Jewish. And I think I saw what a difference it made this year as opposed to previous trips in terms of being able to get across the border. But then once you're on the ground, there's some interesting kind of complications, because for the settlers, it can almost be a reason for them to escalate more, because they see people like me as betrayers of the faith. So rather than just a foolish Christian Italian, I am, betraying the mission. And so many of the settlers in the West Bank are from the US. That creates this other layer where, they're particularly kind of close to Jewish Americans in terms of how they understand their identity. And then people like me are defying that Zionist mission. So that can be complicated. And in general, in terms of interacting with the settlers in the army, I would not bring up being Jewish. And being on the ground, it's actually very important to not wear anything that would be the kind of thing I wear in my day-to-day life that marks me as Jewish. So I'm fairly observant. I wear a kippah, I wear tzitzit. But in the West Bank, that is the uniform of the settlers. And so if I dressed that way, I would be scaring people all the time, traumatizing children, and that's not the goal. And so I would generally be interpreted as a Christian until we got to the question, what is your religion? And that's a question that's often asked along with, how old are you and are you married? Those are some of the first questions. So yeah, I'm too old to be unmarried. That would cause some real disappointment. And then they would ask about religion. I would say I was Jewish. And in almost every case, people were extremely warm. I would often joke immediately after, like, Mish Mustautin, like, I am not a settler in Arabic. And they were like, of course, we know that. We know the difference between Jews and settlers. There were a couple situations where children, in particular, their eyes got wider and I could see them processing this information. And I think where I was this year in the Jordan Valley, there's been a shorter term influence of Israeli and, primarily Israeli volunteers doing solidarity work. Whereas last year I was in Masafer Yatta, where the Center for Jewish Nonviolence has been active for decades. And I can really see a difference in terms of, the way that people understand what Judaism is. In Masafer Yatta, where they have met anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Jews all the time. And then in the Jordan Valley, where it was a little newer. But many, I would say it's a kind of consistent, like 25% of ISMers seem to be Jewish. And, it's something that is meaningful for me to be able to show up as a Jew and to be able to demonstrate that we're not all complicit. We're all complicit in these crimes, especially as a U.S. taxpayer, but that we are not all consenting to these crimes. But yeah, the other thing that would become really meaningful is then to be able to talk about our faith and to be able to share across, different religions what we believe. And that was something that felt like a real way to come together. But I also want to note, as I'm saying this, that I had a powerful conversation in a taxi while I was on the ground. The taxi driver had asked about my religion. I shared that I was Jewish, and he said, the most important thing you need to tell people is this is not a conflict over religion, and interfaith solutions will not solve it. And I completely agree. And in Jewish Voice for Peace work, I often was in conversations about the potential risks of interfaith organizing as a way of framing solidarity with Palestine, because it changes it from a political problem of colonization and occupation to a two sides, religious or ethnic conflict. So anyway, I want to uplift the voice of that taxi driver who, asked me to come back and tell people, like, it is not a religious conflict. It is a political conflict, and it has a political solution.
Absolutely. And the framing it in a religious way also erases Jewish Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, other non-Muslim Palestinians. It completely erases them from the conversation, and also erases, we've talked about on the show, we've had on Karni Kirkonian, who's an Armenian human rights lawyer, who talks about the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, which is Christian. And so they're not ethnically Palestinian, they're Armenian. And so it erases so many different cultures and peoples that have called Jerusalem or the West Bank or other parts of Palestine home for more than 1,000 years. So it's really important to uplift that, for sure. And I want to now get into some of your experiences. If you could just walk us through some of like what a day looked like, and how you basically decided like where to go, and if you'd stay in the same place for several days, or if you were kind of like somebody would call a number, a hotline, and then you'd rush over somewhere if you're needed. Like how did that function?
So there's a different set of possibilities depending upon kind of the moment when someone is working with ISM. And this is something that we go over in training with people who are interested. So anyone who is interested, please go to PAL Solidarity, PAL solidarity.org, and fill out our interest form. But when I went, we had a couple of different locations. And one of those locations was the Jordan Valley, which is very hot. Right now, they're actually under a very severe heat wave, and it's like 47 Celsius, which is over 110, I think, Fahrenheit, though my ability to convert between the two is limited. And so I volunteered to go to Jordan Valley because I lived in Florida for some time and I'm pretty good with heat, and not everyone is. And so I thought, maybe I should see if I could help out there. So I went to Jordan Valley and ended up spending the whole month there. And the rhythm of the days varies some, but typically we'll start in the evening, which is, the way that the day starts in my tradition, but also kind of felt like the way things happened on the ground. So in the evening, everyone goes to the locations that have requested presence and that we can cover. One of the hardest things is telling people that we don't have folks who are able to show up for them. And there was a horrific incident while I was there when no one from either ISM or the other protective presence group that's active in the area, Jordan Valley activists, no one was at a particular home, and settlers invaded in the night. They clearly had been surveilling and preparing for this for some time, and they stole 300 sheep. And they slaughtered most of those on the hills leading away from the village. And it was just, for the next few weeks, every single shepherd was terrified of being alone. So it's vital to have enough people to cover the places that need presence, and then to be able to be there, show up, spend time with the family, get to know how they want to handle any potential settler incursions, how they want to handle it if the army or the police arrive, and understand those things, which many of us do not have a lot of Arabic, which is not ideal. Arabic skills are really helpful. They're not necessary, but they're really helpful. And so those conversations become a little bit more challenging since you're working through translator apps and things like that. But then, there was a night watch. So we would be in shifts, switching off to stay up during the night and make sure that we could kind of keep an eye. And ideally, the family would then be able to sleep. In some cases, the families are too anxious to sleep. So they're also keeping watch. And then that kind of presence of people awake, keeping watch, shining flashlights, moving around, is a way to communicate to the settlers that this place is not unprotected. And then in the morning, often would have some breakfast and potentially go out shepherding, depending on the family, and then come back to our kind of home base where we would then be able to nap, rest, reorganize our bags for the next night, charge flashlights, charge phones, occasionally shower, but water is very scarce. And so we do our best to, conserve water. So that was, everyone has to be very supportive of each other, even though we were not necessarily the cleanest people. And then, make some dinner and figure out the rotation and go out again the next night. So that was kind of the rhythm of the days. And occasionally, different pairs would have a car for rapid response. So they might be moving between places. But most of the time for me, I would just be kind of settled at one place and there during the night, able to get to know the family. There are also places that need 24/7 presence. So these are places where just the level of settler harassment is so intense that they have to have activists there all the time if possible. And so those were um, a different kind of experience, and also like extremely meaningful, because there you're really living with the family, getting to know them. In some cases, the families, have had internationals in and out for years, and they kind of need us to just do our own thing so they can live their lives. But I was part of a group that became the first group providing presence at a community that had requested it and really, really needs it. And so because we were the first, we were kind of a novelty and got to really spend a lot of time playing games, talking, getting to know the family, as well as doing the protective presence work. So I think one of the things that becomes really palpable is, how much this is about stories, hearing people's stories, sharing their stories, um, and sharing one's own story too. I had people ask me things like, so when did you start caring about Palestine? And they were very moved that I said, I've been in the movement since 2014, um, which doesn't say that they don't appreciate the folks who have showed up since October 7th. But, there were lots of questions about, like, how did you come here? Why did you decide to come to Palestine? What do you do the rest of your life? And those relationships are really meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, human to human connection. One might argue that's exactly what settler colonialism lacks. And I wanted to, speaking of settlers, I wanted to, if you wouldn't mind, because I'm sure many of our listeners already know this or understand this, but there's settlers, there's the army, there's police. Could you go through a little bit what these different forces do and what they look like when they come out? I mean, the settlers are just doing whatever they do, but when would the army or the police get involved if they get involved? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the settlers are, I mean, technically, you might say, anyone who came to the land and participated in the Nakba and then since then is a settler. So right now, though, I'll be speaking specifically of the people who have settled in occupied Palestinian territories. So after the 1967 war, Israel began building these settlements. And some of them are legal according to Israeli law, and many of them are illegal, even according to Israeli law. So I want to emphasize that most of the settlers with whom we interact are people who are breaking Israel's own laws. They are in spaces they are not supposed to be according to the state of Israel. And so the settlers tend to go out a lot in the night, but also during the day in usually vehicles, often ATVs, and they kind of joyride around. Especially in the Jordan Valley, there's a number of organizations that are supposedly working with at-risk youth. So Jewish Israeli youth from underprivileged or poor communities are sent to the settlements to have kind of beneficial experiences of working on farms, is how it's sold to the Israeli public, and it's funded by the government and by the Jewish National Fund. So, international and especially like U.S. Zionist groups donate to the Jewish National Fund. And then these young men are basically turned loose on the Palestinian communities in ATVs to just drive around, cause havoc, intimidate, etc. So what will often happen is a situation will start with a settler incursion. So um, settlers will enter Palestinian private land, bother the family, and eventually create so much tension that something escalates, often because the settlers themselves hurt someone. So in one case, the settlers ended up driving into a volunteer they had a motorcycle and they drove into a volunteer. And then at that point, the settlers will call the army and the army will come to investigate the disturbance. And almost every case, what ends up happening is the settlers then leave, the army stays to investigate, and then arrests Palestinians. If the police come, the police don't do very much because most of the areas that ISM is working in, the areas that are being targeted most intensively for ethnic cleansing right now are Area C. And in Area C, it's the army that has supreme authority. The police don't actually have any power. They just have to do whatever the army says. So there are sometimes families who want to call the police because the police are just simply often less escalated, and they might just show up and be like, okay, let's just call this off, you know? Um, the settlers want the army there, and the settlers often travel in tandem with the army. And then the settlers often are the army because so many settlers are reservists who have been called up, and who are kind of serving this dual role. So it really is. I mean, it's a military occupation. And I think that I felt that this year in a particularly powerful way, just because of how absolutely arbitrary everything is becoming. In a couple of other cases, so one night, my buddy and we had just gone to sleep after a shorter night watch than we ended up doing in the future. And suddenly there were lights shining in the tent that we stayed in. So we got up and, ran to the entrance to the tent, and there were settlers there, these young men who were masked with balaclavas. And it was about 12:30 in the middle of the night. And they said in English, "Your time is almost up." We're still not sure why they used English. Maybe they don't speak Arabic. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they thought we were the family. Maybe they knew that we were internationals. Maybe they thought we were Israeli volunteers. We're very unsure what happened. But that was kind of on its own a very alarming incident. But what was more troubling in some ways is what happened before and after. The morning before this happened, the army had stopped at the home and told the family, "We won't be able to protect you from the settlers much longer. They're going to do something and we won't be able to stop them." And so this again is the military that is the supreme authority. They are in charge. These settlers are themselves breaking Israeli law. They've established illegal outposts that, again, are not legal even under Israeli law. And the army, conveyed this message to the family, which didn't feel like a kind warning. This felt like manipulation. It felt like a way of heightening the family's stress. Then there's this incursion and threat in the middle of the night. And then a couple days later, I had left, and we had new internationals present. The army themselves came in the night and just raided the family's home, claiming that the family was in a firing zone, which are these zones that the military has declared are off limits because they're being used for active target practice. The thing is, this family's home is very clearly not in the firing zone. You can see on the map that their home is, 100, 200 yards outside of the firing zone. So one of the internationals was showing that map to the army saying, this is not in the firing zone. This is where we are. And he ended up being hit by the military, and they left. The family was anxious. The family decided to kind of move their sheep a little closer to some of the other Palestinians in the area because they didn't want to be so exposed. This family was being targeted because at the time they were the ones closest to the settlement. Everyone else in that area had already left. And then one night the army came to where the family had moved the sheep, and they tied up the family, including the children, and searched their phones to see if there were any videos from the previous raid. And after that, the family has left. So, the ethnic cleansing, at least for now, has been accomplished. We don't know if the family will try to come back. They have lawyers. They're looking into what their options are, but the lawyers have to operate in the Israeli court system. And, the settlers actually didn't do the most serious violence. The settlers showed up and threatened, and then the military carried out the actual raids, the actual physical violence. And so I think one thing that I want to just really emphasize is that, this is no longer a situation, if it ever was a situation, where there are these illegal settlers who are a problem in Israeli society, who are breaking Israel's laws, and who the military is trying to control and trying to get in line. Like, this is a situation where the military and the settlers are working together, collaborating towards a single goal. And the military is able to push that even further than the settlers because they're even more armed. Obviously, the settlers are very heavily armed and violent, but the military has all of these weapons from the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And we've had on the show, and we've discussed on the show before how, these settlers will just show up in a place and be like, well, we're going to build something here. And even though it's illegal under Israeli law, Israel will often then make sure that they have access to, the things that they need access to in order to make this a legitimate settlement. So, Israel doesn't even follow its own laws, like obviously not international law. But so it really is. It really is just like a free for all. And I know that you said that this family then left. Can you give us an idea of what the status is? I mean, are there people who understandably are like, well, I'm not going to put my children through this. I'm not going to put myself through this, and we're just going to leave. And if so, where do some of these people go? And if people then decide to stay, what does that look like? Could you give us a sense of that ratio, perhaps?
Yeah. I don't know about the ratio, but my experience was that many of the people that we worked with have over the years become incredibly determined to stay. And they're very clear about that. And they rely on the commitment of protective presence to make it a little more possible for them to resist. So that was something that we felt a very strong obligation that, again, sometimes cannot be fulfilled if there aren't enough volunteers, to communities, especially communities who have returned. So communities who were pushed out and then agreed to come back to their land, knowing that the popular committees in the area were going to be working to get international presence and Israeli Hebrew-speaking volunteers to do protective presence work. So there are many, many people who are very determined to stay. And what we see in those cases is that settler harassment shifts from just intimidation to a more kind of legalistic approach that then can be enforced through demolition orders. So instead of intimidating the family through like threats and apparent violence or late night raids, the settlers will send settler security officers, or in one case, there's this settler named Shai who is officially in charge of managing illegal construction in the area. So he is supposed to watch out for illegal construction by anyone. But what he does is he goes to Palestinians' homes, he photographs everything, and then if anything is out of place, a stone, what have you, he reports them for illegal construction. Meanwhile, on the ridge, incredibly visible over the valley, there's an illegal outpost being built. He never goes by it. He never photographs it. And then, once people have demolition orders in place, those orders could be enforced at any time or, not for decades. But it means that they're living in this constant state of not knowing, when the demolition is going to happen. And so, yeah, it feels to me like if the settlers cannot drive people out just through intimidation, then the army gets involved. And if that intimidation doesn't work, that's when they turn to these legalistic methods, including expanding the firing zone, including expanding the security barriers of the settlements. So then, oh, you're here in your home. Well, we've decided that your home is too close to a settlement that we just built, and that threatens the settlement. So, I mean, it's a constant state where the law can be manipulated to whatever ends are necessary. There was an incredible woman that I met, an elderly Bedouin woman. It appeared that she was living on her own, though I don't know. And she refused to talk into the translator. She seemed convinced that I could understand her, even though I kept saying, like, please use the translator app. I don't have, Anna Betty Schweierby. And she, I don't know exactly, everything she was saying, but she was talking about how, everyone is leaving, but I will not leave. I'm going to stay here. This is my house. This is my house. Why would I leave? And, yeah, meeting her was an incredibly beautiful morning. She was just like the kind of powerful elder who, you feel like blessed, by being able to be in their presence. Um, and she's one of the many people who has a sign on part of her house that says that, all these different institutions, mostly European countries and charities, have gathered together to provide something for her to support Palestinians facing dispossession. And it's this kind of constant tension where you go about the West Bank and you see these signs everywhere on the outhouses, on the buildings themselves, on solar panel arrays, all these different things that are making it possible for people to stay, even though, as you mentioned, not only does Israel make sure the settlements have whatever they want, but in fact, Palestinians are blocked from having access to electricity or water or, other things that would make life possible. But, these international organizations, NGOs, and governments have come in to provide these things that do make life possible. But most of those countries represented on those signs are also sending weapons to Israel.
Yeah, and I mean, it feels like, it feels like somebody with lung cancer being, going to get chemotherapy, but they could just stop smoking and it would help. It's like if we just got rid of Israel as the apartheid state, settler colonial state, it would fix all the other problems, and then you wouldn't have to put up signs with, X amount of countries or NGOs that are helping you get the basics of life, like water. And I wanted to ask you about that, kind of rounding out our time here. I mean, what is the feeling on the ground that obviously it's helpful to have folks like you there to be a witness, and that 60% of sharing the message. But I mean, what is the feeling in terms of, okay, but I don't need more NGOs. I just need to get rid of the occupation. Like, what was the feeling on the ground there with that? And what are some like messages that you'd like to share from the people that you spoke to in terms of what we can do, even if we can't go to occupied Palestine? What can we do? What is the ask from folks there?
Yeah. I mean, for many of the adults, they are seeing things in a very dark light. And that was um, challenging to be present for and to witness. People describe themselves as basically like the living dead, not knowing when they will die. And while I was there this summer, the number of martyrs killed by settlers or the army in the West Bank, it felt like there was a new martyr every few days, including Auda Hathaleen, who was a community organizer and activist in Al Khair in Masriata, and who was a particularly important community figure. So this sense that the threat of death is hovering over everyone all the time, and even if they're not killed directly, the threat that their livelihoods will be gone, um, their flocks will be stolen, killed, or they won't be able to maintain them. This also is a threat to life and livelihood. And when people do leave and they move to Area A, which is supposedly under the control of the Palestinian Authority, although Israel invades all the time, and does not respect the PA's authority. And of course, the PA itself has many problems, as we witnessed when the water got cut to one area by settlers, and then the PA wouldn't turn the water back on once the pipe has been repaired. So yeah, with adults, there's that very clear recognition that this ethnic cleansing is happening. And the question is just like how quickly or how slowly, and maybe having us there slows it down a little bit. But it felt like palliative care, essentially. Um, with the children are clearly traumatized. also like delightful, curious, funny, they're kids. And the thing that um, the children would often say is they love chanting Palestine, hurrah, hurrah, free, free Palestine. And then they would say often, Yehudi, bara, bara, Jews, Jews, go away, which was really complicated for me to hear. When they asked me to chant it, I would say Mustautanin, bara, bara, so settlers go away. Some of them said, I don't know how to say Zionist in Arabic, but they would say Zionist, which I also strongly co-sign. But yeah, this kind of fantasy that at some point the settlers will just go away was this kind of chant that the children would go to when their parents were stressed or upset. When the settlers had just come and left, the children would often run around chanting, I think as a way of processing it. And, that the ask is always to make sure people know about Palestine, know what's happening. Folks recognize that there's been a big change in the last few years, but they still know that the world remains not sufficiently aware of what's happening. And then in the West Bank, of course, people often said, make sure that you're fighting for Gaza. They knew and they believe that there should be this priority on Gaza because of the, true horrendousness of the genocide. But they also wanted people to know that the West Bank exists and the West Bank is facing this intensified ethnic cleansing, and more it does feel like the goal is to start creating Bantustans or, enclosed enclaves in the West Bank that will operate like Gaza did before October 7th at these open air prisons. So more and more cities are just completely blocked in, and the army is closing all entrances and exits so that people cannot leave, cannot travel. So, the ask is for the world to do something, for international bodies and for other nations to finally take action. But the taxi driver who asked me to make sure people know, it is a political conflict, not a religious conflict. He also said Palestinians have no faith in international law. Palestinians have no faith in the international community. Like, how can we? And that's something that I am still processing and unpacking. What does it mean to have put all this time and energy into traveling there, to just recognize that, none of it is enough. And certainly, what we all have been doing in the Palestine Solidarity Movement has not yet been enough. And I have to hope that if we keep showing up and if we keep speaking out and putting pressure on our governments, that the change that we need will happen, but too late and too slowly. And, we have to figure out how to grapple with that. While I was on the ground, I found myself, often just really feeling the power of individual moments and honoring and having such deep respect for Palestinians who have been able to find ways to celebrate life and live their lives, even in the face of this horror. So, yeah, one moment particularly stands out to me where settlers had just been driving past a family and, driving onto their land in an ATV. It was the middle of the day, very hot. And then the settlers, after driving past a few times, filming us, they were masked, very militaristic, very aggressive. They drove off and stopped a little bit a ways in the sun, recording and surveilling. And the family, was like, okay, well, they're at least at a distance. So we're going to have lunch, and spread out this beautiful meal under a tree. There was a breeze. we're enjoying this meal, eating, talking, having a beautiful few moments while the settlers were just baking under the sun in their ATV, surveilling this family eating lunch. And so I think like there's something very telling in that contrast, and also something very powerful in the family's, act of resistance in, having lunch despite the intimidation and the harassment.
That's beautiful and awful at the same time. I mean, I think it a lot of people say existence as resistance, but it is perhaps nowhere more true than occupied Palestine. Nikki, thank you so much for going, um, and also for sharing your experiences. Folks, do check out the International Solidarity Movement. Even if you don't have the ability to go, I think it's something that's worth checking out and learning more about. Again, Nikki, thank you so much for what you've done and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for the time, and thank you for your work.